The architecture of silence. For 7 years, the Thanksgiving table at the Thomas Estate in Houston was not a sanctuary of gratitude, but a highly pressurized chamber of judgment. My father, Arthur Thomas, sat at the head of the long mahogany table like an old monarch who had never learned how to abdicate. His hands were thick and heavily lined, a permanent testament to his early days managing the brutal physical realities of Texas oil rigs before he climbed the executive ladder to become a corporate director for one of the nation's largest petroleum conglomerates. Next to him sat my mother, Eleanor, whose elegance was as sharp and cold as a crystal decanter, and my older brother, Julian, a senior petroleum engineer who possessed the brisk, unassailable confidence of a man whose career path had been perfectly paved by our father's legacy. They smelled of heavy crude, of old boardroom leather, and of an aggressive brand of success that measured human worth strictly by the volume of extraction. And then there was me, Ryan Thomas, a man who had traded a birthright of generational oil wealth for a dusty chalkboard. They thought a modest salary and a laboratory at the University of Wisconsin. To them, I was the systemic anomaly, an error in their generational calculus. "Pass the turkey, Ryan," Julian said, his voice carrying that familiar, patronizing warmth that always felt more insulting than an outright slap. "I saw your latest paper in the Chemical Engineering International Scientific Journal. Still trying to power a combustion engine with agricultural waste? It's a cute hobby, little brother. But honestly, if you ever get tired of living paycheck to paycheck on a state university stipend, my division in Houston is expanding. I can get you a research consultant slot. We'd start you at triple your current salary on day one." Eleanor sighed, her fingers delicately adjusting her pearl necklace. "Your brother's right, Ryan. It breaks my heart to see you living so frugally in that freezing Wisconsin apartment after all those years of schooling." "Arthur, speak to him." Arthur didn't just speak. He commanded the room. He set his wine glass down with a heavy, deliberate thud. "You're wasting your prime years, son. A PhD from a top-tier university, and you're using it to play with biomass. It's a dead end. The world runs on petroleum. It always has, and it always will. You're letting pride keep you poor." I took a slow sip of water, feeling the familiar tightening in my chest. I kept my voice flat, operating under a strict law of emotional conservation. "The world is changing, Dad. The chemistry of the future isn't about pulling carbon out of the ground. It's about managing what's already in the air." "The chemistry of the future doesn't pay the mortgage today," Arthur snapped, his voice rising, his eyes narrowing into that terrifying glare that used to make entire boards of directors fall silent. "Look at you. Look at this life you've chosen. You isolated yourself up north, and for what? To be an underpaid public servant." He didn't understand the silence that followed. None of them did. They looked at my isolation and saw a stubborn academic eccentricity. They didn't see the crater that had been blown into the center of my life exactly 5 years ago. Her name was Sarah. She was a brilliant botanist, a woman whose laugh could dissolve the most stubborn academic stress. 5 years ago, an aggressive uterine cancer had invaded her body like a runaway, highly destructive cellular chain reaction. I had spent months sitting by her hospital bed, watching her vital signs decay on a glowing monitor, deploying all the analytical precision of my scientific mind against an enemy that refused to follow the laws of logic. When she died, she took the horizon with her. We had no children. We had only had each other. In the wake of her death, my laboratory ceased to be just a place of employment. It became my monastery, my life support system. I poured every ounce of my grief, every sleepless midnight hour, and every fractured piece of my heart into the cold, predictable precision of chemical reaction engineering. Where human biology had failed me, molecular bonds would obey. I buried my sorrow beneath layers of research into third-generation biofuels and advanced atmospheric decarbonization. My grief became the catalyst that accelerated my work to a feverish, obsessive pace. But to my family, I was just a lonely, impoverished widower clinging to an insignificant university career. The condescension was never limited to my immediate family. The extended Thomas clan was a vast, interconnected network of oil money, and they viewed my career choice with a collective, deeply ingrained contempt. 2 years after Sarah passed, the family gathered for a massive summer reunion at an upscale country club in Austin. It was here that the confrontation escalated from passive-aggressive prodding to an outright siege. My Uncle Charles, Arthur's younger brother and a ruthless, independent oil wildcat, approached me at the outdoor pavilion, holding a glass of scotch. Beside him was his wife, Aunt Beatrice, a woman whose social currency was entirely derived from the size of her husband's portfolio. "Ryan," Uncle Charles boomed, slapping a heavy hand onto my shoulder. "Your father told me you're still up there in Wisconsin, teaching those students how to ferment corn stalks. Tell me, does the state university give you a discount on food stamps, or do you just survive on academic prestige?" A few cousins nearby laughed. Aunt Beatrice offered a tight, artificial smile that held no warmth whatsoever. "Oh, Charles, don't be cruel. Ryan is doing noble work. It's just, well, Ryan, dear, look at your cousins and your brother. Julian just bought a second home in Cabo. Charles's boys are pulling down 6 figures in bonuses before they even turn 30. We all worry about you, especially now that you're entirely alone. Without Sarah, who is going to look after you when your university budget gets cut?" The mention of Sarah's name in that context felt like a chemical burn. My jaw tightened, the knuckles of my hands turning white against my glass. "My budget is secure, Aunt Beatrice," I said, my voice dropping an octave, cold and measured. "Secure?" Uncle Charles scoffed, taking a long gulp of his drink. "Son, let me give you a harsh lesson in practical economics. You're playing in a sandbox funded by government grants and bleeding heart university regents. It's charity. If you had an ounce of your father's backbone, or mine, you'd bring that expensive brain of yours down to the Permian Basin. I could put you in charge of a refining team next Monday. You'd make more in a quarter than you do in 5 years of grading papers. Why do you insist on being the family charity case?" "I'm not a charity case, Uncle Charles," I said, stepping closer, my posture completely rigid. "And with all due respect, your understanding of energy economics is severely outdated. You're trading in finite, decaying assets. You measure your success by how much you can bleed a reservoir dry. I measure mine by systemic stability." Arthur walked up then, having overheard the escalation. He didn't step in to defend me. He stepped in to reinforce the line. "Your Uncle Charles is trying to throw you a lifeline, Ryan. Don't let your stubborn intellectual vanity ruin your life. Look at your clothes. Look at the car you drove in Madison. It's embarrassing. You live like a student while your family runs the energy sector of this state. We're tired of making excuses for you at the country club." The collective judgment of the family stared back at me. To them, my life was a tragic equation of low yield, financial insufficiency, and lonely isolation. I looked at my father, then at Uncle Charles, and finally at Aunt Beatrice. I felt an overwhelming urge to lay out the data, to tear down their arrogance with the sheer weight of my reality. But I refrained. The reaction wasn't ready. The kinetic energy needed to be contained. "Excuse me," I said quietly, turning on my heel and walking away from that room, leaving them to comfort themselves with the familiar, profitable myth of my failure. I stopped correcting their assumptions about my life. I just let it be. It felt entirely pointless to explain what was truly going on with my life and career because I knew they'd never believe me anyway. Family gatherings had simply turned into a regular arena for them to pick apart and look down on every choice I made after Sarah left. What they did not know, what they could not fathom through their narrow, single-variable lens of success, was that while they were counting oil barrels, I had quietly built an intellectual empire. In the dark, quiet years following Sarah's death, my laboratory had become one of the premier hubs of bioenergy and decarbonization research in the world. I wasn't just teaching, I was leading an elite team of postdoctoral researchers, chemical engineers, and material scientists. Over those 7 years, I had quietly secured over 20 foundational international patents. I developed proprietary catalysts and complex, multi-layered chemical reactor systems that didn't just convert agricultural waste or vegetable oils into high-performance biofuels. They did so at an unprecedented thermodynamic efficiency that made commercialization incredibly lucrative. But my true masterwork, the project born out of my darkest nights of grief, was a highly complex reaction system that captured industrial carbon dioxide. By reacting it with water under precisely engineered catalytic pressures, we successfully forced the CO2 to convert into valuable, high-demand industrial chemical feedstocks, the very aromatics that the petrochemical industry spent billions of dollars to extract and refine from crude oil. I had bypassed the oil wells entirely. I had figured out how to turn the sky into a mine. By the time Uncle Charles was offering me a job as a mid-level refinery manager, my patents had already been licensed by commercial conglomerates across 30 different countries. The royalties were quietly accumulating in accounts I rarely checked. I didn't drive a luxury car or buy a mansion in Cabo because those things held no value for me. My resources were consistently reinvested into the next stage of my research. I wasn't poor. I was simply operating on a scale they couldn't see. The tipping point arrived today, on a rainy Tuesday evening during another family gathering at my parents' Houston estate to mark Arthur's formal retirement anniversary. Everybody was there: Arthur, Eleanor, Uncle Charles, Aunt Beatrice, Julian, and all cousins. "So glad you could make it, Ryan," Mom said, as if my presence didn't really matter. Uncle Charles smiled and patted my shoulder, asking with a grin, "Still adventuring with your students? Looking for ways to contribute ideas on how to clean this country of municipal waste?" It wasn't that I didn't know they were bracing themselves to criticize my life choices, but I just gave a faint smile. "I'm still alive and healthy, Uncle Charles." For a moment, everyone present was stunned by my brief, unpretentious answer. And then, the tension quickly dissipated as they all saw that I was simply brushing off all the remarks aimed at me. The atmosphere was thick with the usual self-congratulatory chatter. The massive television in the formal living room was playing a national news broadcast softly in the background. I was sitting on the edge of an armchair, nursing a black coffee, listening to Julian explain his latest drilling metrics to Uncle Charles. Suddenly, the news anchor's voice sharpened, the tone shifting from routine reporting to a major national announcement, a breaking news. In a landmark declaration this evening, the United States Department of Energy has announced a historic multi-billion-dollar green initiative grant. The award is designated to fund the massive, industrial-scale deployment of carbon capture technology. Arthur glanced casually at the screen, but the anchor continued, and a large graphic appeared on the screen next to a prominent logo of the University of Wisconsin. Valued at $2.5 billion, this monumental national project is headed by Professor Ryan Thomas, a world-renowned pioneer in chemical engineering and global decarbonization. Professor Thomas will lead a massive consortium of scientists and industrial partners to execute a rapid scale-up of his patented catalyst technology, which transforms atmospheric CO2 directly into industrial-grade aromatics, effectively revolutionizing the future of global manufacturing and environmental sustainability. The living room fell into an immediate, suffocating silence. The ice in Uncle Charles's glass stopped clinking. Julian froze, his mouth slightly open, his eyes glued to the television screen where a photograph of me, looking stern and focused in my lab coat, was being broadcast into millions of American homes. The news segment showed B-roll footage of my facility, detailing the international scope of my patents and explicitly noting that this project was one of the largest single scientific grants awarded by the federal government in a decade. The anchor described me not as an underpaid professor, but as an elite titan of the new global energy economy. The silence in the room stretched, becoming heavy and toxic with an intense, collective embarrassment. Slowly, painfully, Arthur turned his head to look at me. Eleanor's jaw had dropped slightly, her hand frozen near her pearls. Uncle Charles looked down at his scotch, his face flushed deep red, while Aunt Beatrice suddenly looked intensely interested in the pattern of the Persian rug. $2.5 billion. Oh my God! Eleanor whispered. Everybody was quiet. Nobody moved. For 7 years, they had viewed me through the prism of their own arrogance, treating me like the family failure, offering me condescending lifelines, entirely blind to the fact that I had outpaced them all on a global stage. The reconciliation didn't happen overnight, but the dynamic of the family was permanently altered. The patronizing remarks disappeared, replaced by a tentative, almost reverent caution. Julian's emails became long, detailed, and deeply respectful, asking for my academic perspective on market transitions. 2 months later, my father flew up to Madison. He didn't call ahead. He simply showed up at my university office on a Tuesday afternoon. He looked strikingly smaller outside of his Texas boardroom. He walked slowly around my office, his eyes scanning the framed international patents and the global commendations hanging on the walls. He stopped before a small, framed photograph of Sarah that sat on my bookshelf. When he finally turned to face me, his eyes carried a profound, heavy exhaustion. "Ryan," he began, his voice completely stripped of its old corporate authority. "Your mom and I won't apologize. Charles and Beatrice too. We spent 7 years treating you like a problem that needed to be solved. We thought you were throwing your life away because we couldn't see the immediate financial return on your investment. We were incredibly arrogant. We want to mend this relationship, son. We want to build a bridge back to you." I looked at my father. I didn't feel a petty rush of triumph. I didn't feel the need to throw my success or my wealth in his face. The grief of losing Sarah had long ago burned away any capacity I had for petty malice. "Sit down, Dad," I said gently, gesturing to the leather chair across from my desk. He sat, looking up at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before, a desire to learn. "Dad, I accept your apology, and I want us to be a family too," I said, leaning forward on my desk, choosing my words with practical, pragmatic clarity. "But for us to build a real bridge, you need to understand the baseline of my work. I didn't build this technology to prove you, Mom, or Julian wrong. And I didn't do it to accumulate a fortune." I pointed out the large window toward the campus, where hundreds of young students were walking between research buildings in the crisp afternoon air. "In your world, success is an equation based entirely on accumulation," I said, my voice steady and deliberate. "It's about how much capital you can extract from a system and lock away in a private vault. But let's look at that pragmatically. Wealth, by itself, is a stagnant variable. It doesn't solve structural decay. It doesn't improve the efficiency of the collective machinery. It simply insulates the individual who holds it." I looked back at him, meeting his eyes. "True success isn't defined by what you take from the grid. It's defined by the net optimization of your contribution. My technology keeps industrial manufacturing alive while actively pulling millions of tons of carbon out of the biosphere. It creates a closed-loop system where environmental waste is re-engineered into an economic asset. Every sleepless night, every failed catalytic trial, and every ounce of energy I poured into this lab after Sarah died was an investment designed to ensure that the human machinery functions smoother, cleaner, and more reliably for the next generation. That is the real metric, Dad. If you aren't using your intellect and your resources to upgrade the societal infrastructure and make life demonstrably better for the people around you, then no matter how high your profit margin is, your true net yield is zero." Arthur listened in total silence. His eyes shifted as he processed a definition of value that couldn't be traded on a stock exchange. He didn't argue. For the first time in his life, he simply absorbed the data. A faint, humbled smile finally broke through his weathered face. "I think," he whispered, his voice trembling slightly, "I am finally beginning to understand your chemistry, Ryan." I smiled back, reaching across the desk to firmly grasp his hand. The relationship wasn't perfectly mended in that single hour. Years of friction don't dissolve in an instant, but the systemic blockage had finally cleared. The reaction had begun, and for the first time in 7 years, we were finally moving toward equilibrium.